Welcome everyone to Who Writers Read. This is our final show, so I'm glad you can be here with us today. I'm one of your hosts, Ginger Eager.
And I'm Jodie Forrester.
With us today are Ukrainian writer Oksana Lutsyshyna and American-Ukrainian writer Askold Melnyczuk. Their recent works address the multi-generational effects of war and violence on human consciousness, and they'll each read for us, and then we're going to move into our discussion. Oksana, would you read first for us? Would you?
Sure, I can do that.
I'll read your bio. I wrote an intro for you. Of Oksana Lutsyshyna's recent book of poetry, Persephone Blues, Dr. Vitaly Chernetsky with the Department of Slavic Languages at Columbia University writes, Lutsyshyna demonstrates a readiness to deconstruct the stereotypes of femininity and motherhood while confronting the traumatic experiences resulting from the crisis of contemporary masculinity, both Ukrainian and Western. Published in the English translation in 2019 by Aerosmith Press, Persephone Blues explores memory, family, and war through the shape of language. A writer and literary scholar, Oksana Lutsyshyna is the author of 3 novels, a collection of short stories, and 5 books of poetry. Her latest novel, Ivan and Phoebe, published in 2019, has been awarded the UNESCO Lviv City of Literature Award in 2020, as well as Ukraine's highest literary achievement, the Taras Shevchenko National Prize in Literature in 2021. Ivan and Phoebe has been translated by the English poet and translator Nina Murray and will be published by Dallas-based publishing nonprofit Deep Vellum in spring of this year. Dr. Lutsyshyna holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Georgia and is currently a lecturer in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. We're so honored that she can be with us tonight, and we really look forward to this reading.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So, let's see. How much time do I have for the reading?
About 5 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to read a poem in English, if that's okay. So it's from the collection that you mentioned, published by Aerosmith. And it's this particular one has been translated into English by Olena Jennings. Yevhen and Victor are in uniform in the yellowed photo. The war had just begun and they smile because they were young. And the war had just begun. They couldn't be killed immediately at the very beginning. The war ended and Yevhen was killed. I think he was burned in a tank, but no one knows for sure. But Victor survived and lived a long life, having children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. In his last years, he feared death that would soon befall his gray head, his gray body. Death, he pleaded with death, don't come for me. Don't come for my neighbor, because when I see them carry out his casket, I know I'll be next. And young Death in uniform smiled and said, don't be afraid of anything. Yevhen will recognize you even gray. From now on, no war, no photograph will separate you. Do I have time for one more? Yes, okay. So this one will be from the yet unpublished poems, but also translated by Olena Jennings. Young Toni Morrison and Angela Davis walk, it seems, across Manhattan, walk ahead to happier times when women are freed, when workers are freed, when at least someone is freed. It isn't in vain that one of them learns the dialectics of freedom and the other asks, Lord, what kind of sacrifice is this? What kind of sacrifice when they remember that you are Black but forget that you are beloved? This is 1974, a year that is almost 3/4 of the century, a year when people aren't yet tired of believing, a year of my birth in a whole different country, one in which Angela says, let the great Lenin live, one in which no one has heard of Toni Morrison and no one imagines the songs of the children of the water, We shall gather at the river, Lord, which flows to your throne. Young Toni Morrison and Angela Davis, young in this photo, younger than me now, and braver. The world around them is also young, the way it often is in the era of titans, young and cruel. 1974 is a century without a sickle. It is an iron age, a year of blood which turns into rust, a year of rust which turns into blood. It is the year of the beginning of time, which says to me, and now open your eyes. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. It was such a treat to hear a poem that I haven't even read yet, too. I love hearing poetry before I've read it. All right, Askold, I'm going to introduce you. Let's see. About Askold Melnyczuk's book of stories, The Man Who Would Not Bow, published in 2021, Kirkus wrote, smart, complex stories that never fail to hold the reader's interest. Chinua Achebe wrote of his first novel, What Is Told, a New York Times notable, a marvelous novel and proof once again that the novel is not dead wherever it has meaningful work to do. His second novel, The Ambassador of the Dead, was selected as one of the best books of the year by the LA Times, which noted that Melnyczuk has brought the great tradition of Russian literature to American soil and a transplant that is a work of art. The House of Widows was chosen by the American Libraries Association's book list for an Editor's Choice Award as one of the outstanding books of 2008. About it, Kirkus noted, Melnyczuk's hallucinatory tale achieves some of the fierce, distracting power of D.H. Lawrence's masterpiece, Women in Love. He has received a 3-year Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Writers Grant, the McGinnis Prize for Fiction, and the McGidd Prize from Penn for his work as founding editor of Agni. In 2011, AWP honored him with the George Garrett Award for Outstanding Community Service in Literature. His work has appeared in Glimmer Train, the Antioch Review, The Nation, Plowshares, and the New York Times. He co-edited From Three Worlds, The New Writing from Ukraine, the first English language anthology of contemporary Ukrainian literature published in the US. He has taught at Boston University, Harvard, and in the Bennington MFA seminars. A professor at UMass Boston, he founded Aerosmith Press in 2006. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jody and Ginger, and a pleasure to be reading with Oksana. It's actually a very unusual occasion. We've both never appeared together in this way, and nor have we ever had a conversation about books. So I'm very much looking forward to this with all of you. And I thought that what I would read would perhaps be connected to the second poem that Oksana just read, and it's just the first page of the title story from this book of stories, The Man Who Would Not Bow, in which I try in a couple of pages to compress the background of the Russian Revolution. This sort of brief section is called The Chronology of a Crime, St. Petersburg, 1881 to 1887, and Alexander and Minnie are the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. So this is Alexander recalled Minnie's face the moment his father, the emperor, was carried into the palace after the bomb shredded his leg. The sole of his left foot flapped loose, dangling like a dog's tongue, drooling blood on the marble. Minnie bit her finger to keep from crying out. Alexander pressed his forehead to her shoulder, inhaled her perfume, shut his eyes. Raleigh, the French were geniuses with scent. He could no longer dream. That part of life was over. Years later, when his private train was derailed by anarchists, Tsar Alexander propped the car ceiling on his shoulders while his wife and children crawled out the window. That car freighted his back the rest of his days, and he could never unload it. His empire, meanwhile, was also running off the tracks. Threats against the royal couple forced them to flee St. Petersburg for the Gatchina Palace, 30 miles outside the city. Its 900 rooms became home for the next 13 years. Even there, they weren't safe. A plot to assassinate them during Mass was foiled, and the 5 conspirators, who planned to hide their dynamite inside hollowed-out Bibles, hung. Among them, the older brother of the man who later called himself Lenin. Before turning revolutionary, Lenin's brother Alexander had been an aspiring biologist. Defending himself in court, he declared, "Terror is our answer to the violence of the state." On hearing of his brother's execution, the 17-year-old Lenin said, "I'll make them pay for this." And so, in time, he did. And I don't know if I have time for another. Okay, so that's one story. Then this is another story in the collection that also links to the theme of the book, which, as you mentioned, Ginger, is to do with war and its consequences across generations. This is a story, Termites, and it begins in Damascus. John the Baptist's head must be the best traveled skull in Christendom. Herod interred it on his estate until St. Joanna dug it up for reburial under the Mount of Olives, where it was unearthed by pilgrims in the 4th century. Later cameos in Rome, Constantinople, Petra, and Samaria brought gales of sweaty seekers to their knees. Smuggled by crusaders to France, only to be exiled by the Paris Commune, the head was saved by the mayor of Amiens, making him a national hero. Oliver Street finally caught up with it in Damascus, soon after his divorce. What the young journalist actually saw was the shrine erected inside the sprawling Umayyad Mosque, itself the length of 2 football fields, marble columns, elaborately wrought ironwork, and somewhere behind it all, allegedly, the saint's head. Oliver imagined a cross between a bearded peach pit and a raisin with teeth. Around him, men lolled on oriental rugs, reading books. He listened to the muffled footsteps and whispers of tourists passing a preaching imam in mid-sermon. The mosque was where Jesus was to alight from heaven at the end of days. Oliver stood before the reliquary and shut his eyes. The great vitality of the dead. He folded his hands behind his back and tilted his head to the right. He was sweating. It was hot and he was feverish. He reached inside the pocket of his white linen jacket for a Kleenex. Instead, he felt something glossy he took out. He opened his eyes and looked at the photograph. 2 girls beaming at the camera. He put it away and probed his other pocket. No luck. He wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve and closed his eyes. He hadn't slept in several nights. His hands shook, so he shoved them into his pockets again as he listened to the prayers of the faithful, offered in Arabic, French, English, braid together into a new language, evading the gravity of culture and time. After that craziness in Beirut, the calm descended, and for a moment, Oliver felt he was standing at the center of the world. I'll stop there.
Beautiful. I read that story and actually had to go back and read it a second time because I felt like I went through it too quickly and didn't get, there's so much nuance in it. And yeah, it's really stood out in the collection.
Well, yeah, thanks, Jody. What's interesting for me about writing that story was that the main character in it is somebody who supported our wars in Iraq, and that was what made the story interesting to write, because certainly not, the antithesis of my position, and it allowed me to enter into the experience not through my eyes but through someone else's, and it's somebody who is looking to discover what it means to support something they never themselves have experienced. And it has to do in part with his own kind of discovering more about his family legacy and recognizing that the sort of extremes of experience that he has only heard about are very different when you actually begin to see them up close and in person.
I had that same experience. I won't say too much about it because I don't want to give it away, but with the story Walk With Us, which is where the woman who we all saw so horrifically holding on in, I just blanked the name, Abu
Ghraib.
Yeah.
Yes.
Holding on to the man with the sack over his head and with a leash, to read it from another point of view, from the point of view of her mother in particular, who loved her, and yet couldn't reconcile. I mean, how do you reconcile your daughter who is so beloved with such, you know, with such a horrific sort of the person that she turned, you know, manifests to be? You have a real gift for showing us not common, but, you know, public scenes from a point of view that is very unique. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you know, again, I'm sure that all of us who saw those photographs, which went viral very quickly, of American soldiers in uniform torturing often naked and hooded Iraqi prisoners of war in Abu Ghraib, were, you know, had nightmares after that. And I was certainly haunted by those photographs. And, you know, when you see something like that, you feel some kind of an obligation to respond and register your horror. And at the same time, you know, as I looked at that photograph, I realized that it itself was an editorial. And there was really, I could not think of anything to say directly about it. And so the question kind of became for me is how to approach that experience from another angle, and to remember that the person who was the torturer, the young woman who became a torturer, had not been born a torturer. And of course, the question is, you know, how the hell do you wind up in that position, in that situation? And so, yeah, I mean, I had to let go of the photograph and, you know, move into that sort of strange realm of the imagination and see what answers it had for allowing you to kind of get close to that person. You know, because the other thing is that it's so easy to just scream and point fingers and shout, and yet you know that there was a sequence of events that propelled this person, this you know, once a child, once a baby, once an infant, and beloved by a mother, into this impossible position. And of course, you realize that that position, the situation, is created by forces and powers far beyond most of our sort of capacity to control. And, you know, that is one of the things that I'm always sort of wondering about, how any of us reconcile and kind of come to terms with in our lives. There are so many things that we can manage in our immediate worlds, and so many decisions that appear to be made for us by larger sort of state and social structures. Anyway.
Back to the theme of who writers read, because this distancing that you were able to achieve as a writer about, you know, something that so calamitous, are there books that you've read? Are there authors that you've read that basically mirrored or gave you permission to write in that, or in that manner?
I can't say that I was thinking of any particular literary models at that point, but rather reflecting upon experience. I mean, similarly with the Damascus story, when I had been to Damascus and Beirut at almost the last moment when it was possible to go and visit. And, you know, I'd been invited by a couple of writers after the Israeli-Lebanese war in 2006 to go and see what a war zone looked like. And yeah, no, I was not. I mean, I can't say I was leaning on any models at that point, but simply looking for imaginative freedom, right? Because, you know, what we're always asking is, what is it that we can bring to an experience that a journalist has not already covered for us? And as not being an eyewitness to so many of these events, you also wonder about how you yourself can enter into what is resonant over time about such an event. And for me, it's always, you know, when a horror happens, I mean, it's happened. Now we're dealing with the survivors. Now we're dealing with the after effects of the horror. And I'm sure, like all of you, you know, I wonder about how to come to terms with it, what my relationship with it is, to what degree does my silent condemnation help or affect anything? How can I understand the human presences behind these actions? All those are the sort of impulses that I think again animate the imagination. You can let the imagination do its work. I don't know, but Oksana, you have similarly touched on war and violence without, I think, perhaps having that much personal direct experience of it.
Well, that's true. Though, however, I would say that to a large degree there's violence in the everyday, or there was violence in the everyday of, say, Soviet realities, just that we were not necessarily configuring it correctly or recognizing it or knowing how to recognize it. Nowadays in Ukraine, we have, of course, the whole generation of people who have been to the front lines and who actually experienced war in this very close, much closer way. So it's always troubling. Or how do you write about it, and what do you make of it? And I know that it's maybe in some poems, but in fiction it would be very difficult for me to actually do that. I think I kind of consciously or unconsciously try to avoid it. It's almost like it's a bad spell to touch that. So, but returning to Askold's collection, I actually have it here too. This quite amazing capturing of this variety of emotions, and sometimes not the emotions you would think that a person feels when they are confronted with violence. And yes, there's some angles, like looking at this woman's biography from the point of view of her mother. That was very touching. And the Damascus story is absolutely amazing. Some of the personal experiences that the journalist has there that are, threatening but not deadly, and yet they are just like defining thing for him. He's completely devastated emotionally about all that.
Oksana, your poem, Generation Facebook, I would love to bring that into this particular conversation, this idea of images and how we respond to them and what the limits are. So if there's anything you'd like to say, I kept thinking of it.
Sure, yeah. I don't know if I have this poem around, but basically it's about that the collective pain keeps spreading like a light from the candle, but it doesn't really relieve any kind of problematic feelings. The role of the spread of information or social media, it's a very powerful thing that I think we are all still exploring. We still don't know yet where it ends and what it really means. But I know from my experience as a person who follows social media, for example, during Ukrainian Revolution of 1314, and also the military actions, the war with Russia, it's a little bit more scary to actually stare at the screen than it would be to be within a living environment of people, even within more dangerous situations. That's what people reported in Kiev in 2013-14, that it was more scary at home near the screen than it was actually in the square standing there with others. So it's a good thing for the spread of information, but whether all the information needs to be spread, I cannot say. I'm not much of an expert, but it's a great uniting tool, I guess, for the announcements. But how exactly it affects us, the long-term effects, I think we still don't know.
Both you and Askold's writing seems to be extremely influenced by external situations. And I'm wondering, are there authors that you have emulated? Are there authors who have modeled and influenced and inspired your work?
You, Oksana.
Okay. Well, that's an excellent question, and I think about it a lot. And I think a lot of the authors that probably formed me and inspired me was the wrong authors, because they were the authors that were available at the times of my, adolescence or childhood or youth, and it was not any kind of systemic reading. It was mainly just reading for the sake of, I guess, pleasure or maybe escapism. This is what I think now. And my students always ask me, how come you've read so much? And I always answer, that's because there was nothing else to do in the Soviet Union. We didn't have cars to drive. We didn't have any fancy machinery to master. We couldn't travel much. So, reading was the only way. And now, especially in the times of when people have, young adult literature, when it's actually filtered what comes to children or to adolescents, none of that was there. We were reading things by Alexander Dumas and, adventures of men always. And there were some few women characters there that were sort of inconsequential or demonized or glorified. And Treasure Island, in which there's not a single positive character. Everybody's like a complete psychopath if you think about it, because everybody's unruly and does whatever, and they're all men. There's like one woman who's the mother of the main character, and she's there for the first 15 pages. So and I guess it forms a certain image that you are this kind of a pirate man warrior with a sword, and then you wake up and actually you are not that at all. So I think that the rest of my life is just trying to reconcile with that. And and of course, I mean, there were people who eventually did constitute some other kind of stuff. So for example, Gogol, who I know is important for Askold as well, and who is Russian, but who is also Ukrainian by origin. So you can trace a lot of Ukrainian themes and demonology. And I should also say Victor Hugo, and I know that he's not exactly a feminist writer either, but somehow he was a very big influence. And then a slew of Ukrainian writers, for example, Lesa Ukrainka, who is the end of 19th, beginning of 20th century modernist, and she's actually feminist, but maybe not using that same word. So, and I actually always liked things that had some sort of entertaining plot, I guess. So I try to emulate that as much as I can myself in my writings.
But yeah, that's wonderful to hear. I mean, Victor Hugo also makes me think that there's his sort of social conscience and his awareness that connect to the question you asked also about the influence of external forces, or the awareness of external forces and pressure on individuals. But I also did not mean to elide over this question of literary influences and presences so much as I was speaking specifically about the approach I took to those two stories that I had read from, because God knows, I was immersed in my mother was a great reader, and she insisted that we learn Ukrainian before we learn English, even though I was born in Jersey. And so my first 6 years, I was listening only to Ukrainian work read out loud or reading it. And so writers like Taras Shevchenko and Ivan Franko, which will mean nothing to anybody else except perhaps to Oksana, and Lesya Ukrainka as well, and Maxim Rishki and Mikhailo Kochubinsky, and a great many other names were sort of the bread and butter of our house. And I suppose in some ways they created the sense of distance between what I was experiencing and what captured my imagination. I suppose in some ways that may address the sort of the temptation to get some distance on one's characters and approach them from a different perspective, because the language in which I read things was so very far away from the language I heard around me every day when I stepped outside of our house. But also I wanted just to connect, before we leave the question of violence and war behind, Jody, I think I'd love to hear you talk about, and Ginger, both of you have written about different kinds of violence, and both Ginger, you about violence within a family, and Jody, you about the kind of social circumstances that were, in fact, driving you into a certain place in your memoir, where you thought violence was necessary, and here, and I wonder how you sort of what role writing had to do in your kind of coming to terms with that idea of violence.
Hey, Ginger, you take this first.
I would say that everything I write is for myself. I wish that I had a broader sense of audience, but I don't know that I really do, if I'm honest. And so I wanted to write the book that my 17-year-old self may have been able to pull off the shelf and understand what she was living in the middle of, right? Because it takes a long time to understand the patterns that we are not, that not only entrap us, but that we risk perpetuating and are perpetuating. So that would be why I wrote that book.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, in my situation, my book is called Guns Under the Bed, Memories of a Young Revolutionary. And so that kind of gives you the context. In the late 60s and early 70s, when I first went to State College, I already had very strong feelings against the Vietnam War and for civil rights, and had already marched for those causes. But considered myself a nonviolent person. I very much modeled myself as a person with the teachings of Martin Luther King and Gandhi even. And then, when I got to school and the war was even ratcheting up, and the horrific sorts of tortures done by the American soldiers, or by America Central Command to the Vietnamese people, was even more disruptive to my way of thinking. And I ended up joining an organization that was a revolutionary organization and gathering guns for what we considered very likely a revolution that was going to happen, an armed uprising, modeling ourselves after Mao Zedong. And I had a lot of repugnance and confusion. I was 17, 18 years old, but I came to really believe that the only way we were going to, it's not like the imperialists were going to just say, oh, we're doing the wrong thing, we're walking out of here. The only thing that seemed viable to me was armed revolution, therefore being armed. And indeed, at that point, I was sleeping with 2 rifles under my bed for the eventual what we considered reality that we would be confronting and moving forward in a way that was going to change the world. Over time, I really actually began to realize how phenomenally misguided that was. But there was that time was a period where I really believed that violence was the only way to be participating in a violent or overthrow was the only way that I personally, and that those of us of like mind, were going to be able to make a difference. It horrifies me now. I had many, many, many years of nightmares about these guns. There was a situation that we thought the cops were going to break into the house. We sat in a living room armed, ready to confront them, which thankfully didn't occur. And as Askold knows, I suppressed that part of my life because of the horror of how can I tell people, well, when I was in college, I had an M1 ready to blast the heads off of pigs. And it wasn't until I went to Bennington writing seminars and met Askold where he started extract that story from me. And I realized, yeah, that's I did embrace violence. And that is part of who I am and true for me. And that's where I began writing the story. So I've always been thankful to Askold for showing me that that was not something to be either embarrassed by or self-loathing about.
No, it's profoundly important, I think, and I'm really grateful to you for writing it, precisely because, it's so interesting what you just said about responding to, again, the images from Vietnam. I remember that, and there's a clear parallel to responding to the images for Abu Ghraib. And I remember the intensity of the late 60s and early 70s. And the sense of hopefulness that some kind of revolution was possible. It did take time and experience to discover that um, change, which I believe is coming and will come for the better, come slowly, and through very kind of deliberate efforts of the sort that, say, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, which Ginger, you and Oksana both have in common, is pursuing. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for writing that great book.
And thank you, obviously, for leading me to it. Are there poets? I imagine mostly Ukrainian, but are there poets, Oksana, whose work you particularly revere?
Yes, I should say so. And it's really quite a collection of different people, but there's a tradition in our schools to make children recite the poems by heart, which I know is not done in the United States. And somehow you kind of dislike it when you're a child, and rightly so, I suppose. But I think it did matter in some ways, because some people say they don't return to poetry after that, but I think it's actually a minority. Many people eventually return to that later in life, like, for example, with our great poet Taras Shevchenko, whom we mentioned before. So I think every Ukrainian could say that they took something away from that. But then our house was full of books, thankfully. So I read a lot of poetry when I was young in translation. However, I wouldn't claim that I've read it in English or in other languages. One of my great fascinations at one point was Arthur Rimbaud, for example. Then I discovered as a child, somehow, I don't even know how, Juana Inés de la Cruz, and I studied some of her sonnets by heart by just this school habit that I acquired. And I thought they were perfect. They were, the translation was great, later found them in Spanish and so on. As for American poets, that probably would be later, after I have already come to the States. And well, actually, no, probably a little bit before. I developed great love for Wallace Stevens at one point. Somebody showed me a poem about this, the 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. And eventually I translated some of his poems into Ukrainian. So those would be probably some, just some details about my formative years in terms of what kind of poetry I read. And actually, reading different translations of the same poet can give you a lot, even if you cannot yet read the original. And so we would collect those and kind of exchange them, and just look at how the tone works. So, and then by the time you grow up and learn the language of the original, you sort of feel at home a little bit more.
Nice. That's nice.
Could we talk about Beloved too, Oksana and Toni Morrison?
Oh yes, well, that's why the book I read it already when I came to the States. I believe would be early 2000s, and not just that. I think I've read several of Toni Morrison's books in a row, and it made a profound impression on me. I never read anything like that. Looking, from many angles, speaking from many angles. So this sort of unmistakably feminist voice and focusing on women's experience, though Ukraine would seem like a country where women had rights to vote very early and so on and so forth. It's all very tricky, and it's not until some explicit voices, for example Oksana Zabushko's, who started talking about it openly, but that was already 1990s, were we aware of any kind of feminist heritage. I believe one of the history books by Marta Bohachevska-Chomiak the title is very telling, and I love that book, Feminists Despite Themselves. So that pretty much sums it up. So that was one big revelation, that you can actually write about women's body and say so much. And then of course the history of African Americans in the United States, which, believe it or not, is not exactly known for what it is in some parts of the world, and the former Soviet Union included. The Soviets had this very strange approach to it, which would be kind of mythological, but not historic at all. They would be emphasizing the fact that, people were oppressed because of their race, but then they would add, but they were liberated, things are fine. They never spoke about the fact that the liberation didn't just happen magically, is that people were actively fighting for it. I suppose that idea of active fighting kind of scared the Soviets, no matter what the context. So they were mythologizing it. So the only readings that we available would be something like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which would, the Black community would have issues with that book, because it's talking about, a man who's kind of reconciled with the condition of slavery instead of protesting against it. So that was my other big shock as a person who's never studied this formally. And so then I started studying it formally.
Thank you. Yeah, that Beloved is one of my all-time favorite books.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And similarly, when I first read it, I mean, the female body, the fact that the open talk about nursing, and then also the wounds on her back, and
the 3 on her back,
yes, and then even the embodiment of the pain, in a feminine form, all of that was so impactful.
Yes, it definitely was.
You guys have gotten some questions here in the chat. We have, since we speak here about the portrayal of war and violence, I would like to ask the following. There is a need for literature for young readers in Ukraine about the famine in Ukraine, Holodomor, and the Nazi atrocities against Jews, Babyn Yar, and other difficult historical traumas. How does one approach these violent subjects for young readers? And this is from Uliana Hilnchak in Toronto.
That one's for you, Oksana. What books are there that you might send? Although I just have to note that the first time I visited Ukraine in 1990, I was taken to visit a number of high school classrooms, and what actually struck me there was that I think at least 2 of the 3 classrooms I visited, but the writers the books the students were reading were The Color Purple, Jamaica Kincaid, and Richard Wright. So I was actually very surprised and very interested in seeing the widespread sort of awareness of relatively contemporary African American literature there. Anyway, this was in Kyiv, so I don't know. I'm sure it varied from place to place. But yeah, I don't know what books are there about the whole. What fiction is there about the Holodomor or young?
Well, I think that's a great reference with what you have just mentioned. I don't think Uzhhorod was quite as advanced. That's the city I'm from. But as far as the young adult and children's literature, there's been some great initiatives now in Ukrainian letters, and some publishers specifically, commissioning books on different events to writers. And I am not sure if they have gotten yet to Babyn Yar and Holodomor. But I do know that at least one publishing house, Portal, now has lots of books. They have a series of 70 books for young adults, kind of telling them what happened, sometimes in a more like essay type form, history, sometimes as fiction. They have stuff about material deprivations during the Soviet Union, for example, but it's called Союз Радянских речей, like the Union of Soviet objects or artifacts or something, instead of republics. And they have a couple books on Chernobyl, and I actually have those because I work with the theme. So it's really, we're getting there. We actually came to the awareness of the necessity of specifically this young adult children book part of the readership. So, and there are people who do research into that because it used not to be even the area much during the Soviet times. So, and I'll have to think about whether we actually have yet anything on Holodomor and Babyn Yar. But
there is that sequence of poems that Mariana Kianovska published, right?
Oh yes. I think Uliana asked about young readers, but as far as adult readers, there's definitely more. Though we still could use more. And yes, Mariana Kianovska's book about Babyn Yar is now, they published it in Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and Actually, Alexander Verbuch just published a book about basically Holocaust. He's a Ukrainian author who right now lives in Canada. So, and then there is Katya Petrovska, who published Maybe Esther. It's a novel, but it actually was originally written in German, but then they translated it into Ukrainian. But she's Ukrainian. Mm-hmm.
I think teenagers can read most anything that adults can read. This whole idea of young adult literature is, I think, more of a marketing tool than anything else. And when I read young adult literature, I think, well, these topics are just as heavy. It's just more plot centric and we're going faster. We just slow down.
That's very true. But I think for a while, at least our children's literature was somewhat inadequate in that it tried to shelter the readers. It was trying to talk kind of out of the age group, you know. So adventures of teenagers were not described in the full force of emotional impact. I mean, Romeo and Juliet were teenagers, right? So, and yet, you know, we all know what happened. But these were sort of like teenagers who were some sort of more artificial, in an artificial world. So real problems like such as you know, parents who are seasonal workers somewhere in Italy, so you live with your grandparents, or, you know, problems of economic inequality, or issues that have to do with war, or memory, traumatic memory like Holodomor and Babyn Yar. It was kind of outside of the text. So I think now they're trying to bring it much more into the text.
Beautifully said.
Although it's almost going against the trend in this country, because we're not we're trying to erase reality. We don't want our children to be reading Toni Morrison, not in Florida. We don't want them to be reading James Baldwin, right? And in fact, a lot of these things are happening in Texas, aren't they? You know, as books are not being banned, being extracted from libraries and or banned from curricula of public schools. So it's
yes, I just read this. Yeah,
you know, so it's we're in a weird place in this country at this moment. I don't know, Ginger, how are things in Georgia?
How are things in Georgia, right? Well, I firmly believe that those people are in the minority. I mean, that is absolutely true in Georgia. And the only reason that hasn't been reflected in Georgia's leaders is because of voter disenfranchisement. That's all that it has to do with. So we just need to keep fighting for equal voting rights, and then we can elect the people like Stacey Abrams.
Yeah.
Even in the smallest communities in Georgia, maybe like maybe in the northwest of the state, you might have communities where this isn't true. But for most of the state, you have a very strong liberal African-American population. And increasingly, you have a white working class liberal population. And there is no reason for us to have the people in power that we do. It all has to do.
That's music to my ears. Thank you.
You're welcome.
To hear that, yeah. I was also going to say that I was. Can I just say a word about poetry, because you know part of our subject here is, you know, who writers read, and one of the things that is so important for me as a fiction writer is to regularly immerse in poetry. This past week, I have been reading two fabulous books. Well, actually rereading one of them. One of them is for a very practical reason, is Derek Walcott, the poet Derek Walcott's last book, White Egrets. And I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's gorgeous in its evocation of the natural world, in the sort of ways in which he discovers he works with language at the nano level, with what Jody you called microtones, and where words, you know, flower from other words, and it's such a transformative experience to engage with language at that level and to surrender to a poem. You know, so I just read an essay about his work last night that really kind of left a powerful impression on me, and I have to just say something about it. By Rosanna Warren. And one of the really interesting things about it is that she also writes about the way in which poets are often doubting the value of their work. What does it mean to be a poet in this world where so much of what seems to matter happens beyond the realm of the study, the office? The poets have asked this in so many different ways. Right, most famously, W.H. Auden said that poetry makes nothing happen. And yet I have to say that as a reader of poetry, of great poetry, I never wonder that. With poetry, with great poetry, I feel so connected, so in the moment. It clarifies, it concentrates, it gives meaning to the moment and experience itself. And in fact, it feels like much more like real life than so much of the rest of life does. and so anyway, another book that I'm reading right now is In King's Touch by Tom Slay, which also deals with, he's been working as a war correspondent quite a bit in the last few years, and has been through a number of the sort of most distressing refugee camps in Kenya and in and has come back and kind of reported on them both as a journalist but also as a poet. And it's not material you normally associate with poetry, and yet that kind of the ways in which a poem leaps and moves in a stanza and brings together disparate experiences, brings home an experience that is very far from us, but in a way that doesn't leave you enervated and sort of kind of trembling the way that getting the word from social media does. And yeah, anyway.
Well said. There's another thing in this chapbook which I want to acknowledge because he wrote it thoughtfully. Stephen, sorry, it's hard for me to see this. Stephen.
You want me to read it for you, Judy?
Yeah, well, no, yeah, go ahead, Ginger. It's my eyes.
All of us. Stephen Ratner. When Jody told her story about her passionate college revolutionary moment focused on the strength of a belief that did not endure, I couldn't help but think of the January 6th insurrectionists, who likely had an equal intensity about their beliefs. I guess we can only hope that sharing stories and poems like those of our two authors can offer us some breathing room where we might come to understand where and through whose agency our convictions actually come into being.
Yeah.
And what I like about that is that he really did bring it. I mean, this was for me the late 60s, early 70s. And yet, what we saw on January 6th, not truthfully, not that I condone violence, but I get it. I really get it that when these people need to make their statement, what makes the biggest statement is the overt violence. Some people say, well, like, why shatter, shops windows? And then in fact, that's what we did also. You just need to make some kind of statement about capitalism, about the systems that oppress, and violence is part of that language that's comes up both sides. Obviously, I mean, in Vietnam there was the burning of the villagers and the raping of the women.
Which you're reminding me that Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese Tibetan, or the Vietnamese Buddhist, transitioned a couple of days ago, and I'm sure that many of you have read his work, his idea of being peace, his idea of interbeing, his idea of there he was in the middle of this violence in Vietnam and wondering how to respond to it, and choosing to respond by trying to help where he could those who suffered the effects of violence. That's another kind of alternative choice. And I think it's a choice that I hope reading helps